Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Bookshelf, brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. In Bookshelf, we interview and speak to authors on their recent books that are making waves. And today we're going to talk to Vineet Thakur, the university lecturer at the Institute for History at Leiden University. On his wonderful new book, India's First Diplomat, V.S. Srinivasa Sastri and the Making of Liberal Internationalism, which is published by Bristol University Press just a couple of months ago. Vineet, welcome.
Thank you very much, Karthik.
So Vineet, you're a diplomatic historian, a historian of international relations, and you're interested in centering the global South within IR debates, and also to question Western dominance within IR. So this book, in a way, is an interesting, perhaps unexpected book for a historian to write, focusing on an individual like V.S. Sastri to understand India's early diplomacy, even before its independence. So tell us, who was Sastri? How did you discover him, and then decide that his life can be used as a window to answer larger questions and issues?
Again, thanks very much, Karthik, for those questions. I mean, in order to answer who was Sastri, it's important for me to answer how did I sort of arrive at writing about Sastri. I mean, I didn't know sort of anything about Sastri until about, I think, 2014. I had recently sort of graduated, done my PhD, and moved to South Africa for a postdoc. And, you know, like a good Indian boy, I went to Durban, as you go, for a pilgrimage to see Gandhi's Phoenix ashram. But once you go to Durban, there is another monument to sort of the struggle of Indians, and that is a college, a senior secondary school called Sastri College. So when I went to Durban, that was actually one of the first times I really sort of heard about Sastri. And it was quite intriguing to me that the person after whom the college was named spent most of his life in India. In fact, he spent just 19 months in South Africa, but he isn't really remembered in India at all. I mean, you know, we've all read our history books and everything, but I can't remember an instance where I had sort of come across Sastri's name in sort of the pre-independence period. So that have kind of sort of piqued my interest, and I started reading more about Sastri. But at the same time, around the same time, I was also trying to sort of write a short book on Jan Smuts and his sort of diplomatic encounters with some of the Indians at the international fora. And Sastri was one of the people he had a sort of a rivalry with. So in a way, then, you know, this sort of pushed me to sort of read a bit more about Sastri, and there's a bit of that Sastri in that Smuts book. And from there onwards, I really wanted to myself know more about Sastri, but also sort of because, like I said, Sastri spends 19 months in South Africa, and he spent that as India's first agent, which is sort of an equivalent to an ambassadorial position. You know, it kind of, for me, sort of generated a whole lot of questions about pre-independence Indian foreign policy. What was it? Because our understanding is that the foreign policy starts in 1947, right? So the idea I had was to sort of write about pre-independence Indian diplomacy through this sort of figure, through the figure of Sastri. And in my mind, I had these sort of 5 or 6 episodes that I wanted to write about, and all of them were in Sastri's life in the 1920s. So I thought, might as well make it a diplomatic biography. So the chapter scheme, as you've seen the book, there's a more of sort of episodic histories of these sort of 5 or 6 sort of places that Sastri was in. I also, and this is something that you sort of prefaced, I'm interested in centering figures of the global South in narratives about international relations. And Sastri again was intriguing to me because, you know, I had read Ares Manela's book on Woodrow, sort of the Wilsonian moment. And one of the chapters, in fact, starts with an epigram from Sastri. And what I found out was that, and Manela uses that to say that, Sastri was really inspired by the Wilsonian dream and so on and so forth. But if you actually read what Sastri wrote about Wilson, he of course sort of celebrates Wilson, but then he argues that it's not really Wilson, but the Japanese who need to be commended for including, Asians and everyone in global diplomacy. And then the more I followed Sastri's career, it seemed to me that he's a very important figure for liberal internationalism as such, and he's not just an Indian figure. To me, he's very important in not just in navigating the contours of liberal internationalism of that time, but also shaping it, especially in terms of the discourse about race and rights. So that's why Sastri becomes this figure through whom I can tell these different stories, and that's what I try and do. Now, who was Sastri? Sastri, in the book, as I say, he was sort of India's first diplomat because he spent the 1920s as sort of India's roving ambassador. But of course, that's not primarily those who know his work do not know him primarily as a diplomat, but they know him primarily as a very tall Indian liberal leader in the 1920s and 30s. He was the president of Service of India Society that Gokhale had started, and when Gokhale passed away in 1915, he became sort of president until he left for South Africa. And he played, along with Tej Bahadur Sapru and others, a very instrumental role in a whole lot of what I'd call sort of initiatives for which in the long run led to India's constitution, from Montagu-Chelmsford to roundtable conferences and so on and so forth. So he's had quite a rich life as a liberal, and that's what sort of his contribution, at least to India, was. But I look at, of course, more at his diplomatic contributions.
I think one key contribution of the book is that India had a foreign policy before independence, even though it's sometimes it's referred to as an anomalous kind of position within various international regimes, organizations, and negotiations, where you see Indian representatives there, and they have positions and they're representing the interests of India. So what does Shastri's life and experiences tell us about Indian diplomacy before independence, and specifically for battling for citizenship rights globally, just when they lack that at home, right? And also, maybe if you can just lay out the time period that you look at in the book, which is between 1919 and 1929, and why that 10-year period was so critical in terms of the themes you cover in the book, like self-determination, war, empire, the rise of transnationalism, race, and the role that the role that India played and could play, which in a way also empowered Shastri.
Thanks again, Karthik. I started in 1919 because of Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, and one of the very interesting things about those reforms are, and this is something that you don't, if you are, if you're a student of international relations, this is quite sort of counterintuitive, that India's international status was in advance of its domestic status, right? It had a certain international presence or international equality which it did not have internally, which meant that as a diplomat, and like you said, it's quite interesting that you are kind of a citizen of the world when you are representing your country and treated as an equal outside of India, but within India you don't have a citizenship status. And for somebody like Sastri, this international equality meant that it was inevitable that domestic equality will also follow, because there's this argument of a whole lot of liberals was that, of course, where do you see an instance of a country which has internationally is considered an equal, and India is the only case, which meant that the domestic equality will quickly follow. And at least from in the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, there was this sort of whole idea that India is advancing towards self-government, and at some period in 10 years' time, they would revise it and probably give sort of greater sort of institutions of self-governance and even dominion status. And so for somebody like Sastri, this international presence was very important because it affirmed the inevitability of sort of dominion status for India. It seemed like only a matter of time that it happened. So that's why for him, that is important. That sort of status is important, but it is also important because Indians are not treated well internationally, right? Overseas Indians, and we all know about sort of struggles of South African Indians and Indians in Kenya and so on and so forth. And the argument was that how can we expect domestic equality if our overseas Indians were supposed to be subjects of the empire at the same level as Australians and everyone else when they are sort of not treated well? So again, so the argument is flipped, that if they are treated well internationally, we would also be treated well as sort of domestically. And then, of course, there is this whole idea about, and from this sort of their ill treatment, there is this sort of fundamental disconnect between what the Commonwealth, the new emerging Commonwealth, is proposing, which is equality of subjecthood, and what is its reality, which is that there are Indians and Africans who are ill-treated, who are racially discriminated against. So his role is basically sort of to push for the rights of equality of Indians and such. But this is also an interesting period, because what is also happening at the level of the Commonwealth or the British Empire, where the British Empire, on the one hand, is trying to sort of turn into a more egalitarian idea of the Commonwealth. And I explained in the book why that is so, because Britain cannot control, cannot be the hegemon anymore without seeking support from the members of the Commonwealth. And India is a most important part of that Commonwealth. But at the same time, the more egalitarian the empire is trying to become, it means it is giving more rights to the dominions. And the dominions, one thing in which the dominions want absolute control is their immigration policies: white Australia, white Canada, white New Zealand. And the way they use that power is primarily to sort of legislate a slew of anti-immigration measures against what we call Asiatics, Indians, Japanese, and Chinese. So there is a fundamental disconnect between what the empire is proposing here and an increasing sort of level of discrimination that's faced by primarily Indians, because Sastri is concerned about Indians, and therefore Sastri becomes an important sort of presence during those times, because he's trying to articulate for the rights of Indians. So that's sort of the context in which Sastri conducts his diplomacy.
So, I mean, through the book, you show the places where he traveled, and he traveled across the Commonwealth to represent India within the imperial orbit, to raise concerns of Indians in countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. How much power and authority did he have at these conferences? Because you categorize him as a native diplomat, right? What do you mean by that? And how did he try to maneuver as a representative of India, but also of the empire?
When I call him a native diplomat, I think this is the fundamental premise I start with, is that a diplomat is fundamentally an unexceptional figure. Diplomat is somebody who sort of ought to represent their country, their own individuality. Somebody like Sastri is his power. He's sent around the Commonwealth, he's sent around these dominions, primarily because he's considered this exceptional Indian figure. And he's almost always compared to Gandhi, now the other exceptional Indian figure. The difference is that, Gandhi is that fanged native, whereas Sastri is the cultured, mild-mannered, sort of the apogee of British colonialism, as it were. Because not only he's not a mimic man, in using sort of the Naipaul's term, but he's somebody who also shows his own initiative. And as I argue in the book, that's what colonialism is aiming at. Colonialism is not really aiming at sort of producing sort of brown apes. It's looking at producing these people who are sufficiently sort of English Anglophiles, but also sort of display their own sort of individuality. So when you said, so what's the power that he has? Not a lot. He's representing a sort of a colonial or a colonized country. And when he goes to all of these conferences, so for instance, he goes to Washington, he has really no role to play. Much of what he does actually happens outside the conference than within the conference. But within the sort of imperial scheme of things, within these imperial conferences and in places like South Africa, Canada, and Australia, it is primarily through the force of argument that he's trying to sort of change policies and opinions. He's successful at times, he's not successful at times, but I think what he does brilliantly is sort of the marshal the language of diplomacy. Diplomacy in some ways is also the power of the weak, because diplomacy is one sphere in which I think through what Habermas calls this communicative rationality, through the power of agreement, the power of rational argument, you can try and engage the other side and try and come to some kind of a compromise. And that compromise for Indians, coming as he came from a position of absolutely no power, is still in advance. So I think that's how he sort of he navigates this whole sphere. It's primarily through the sort of force of rational argument that he's able to pass whatever resolutions and a whole number of things that he's part of. And an important sort of instance I give in the book is this, the Cape Town Agreement of 1927, where this very interesting sort of play of language, where first, of course, it's South Africa, perhaps the most racist of all countries, and Indians are going to negotiate with them. That itself seems sort of quite extraordinary. But then South Africa and India coming to an agreement. And one of the set of sentences there is, and I'm of course paraphrasing, it says something to the effect that a civilized country, you can only be a civilized country when you care for the welfare of your permanent population. Essentially, what it's trying to tell South Africa, white South Africa, is that you only become civilized when you provide for welfare functions for Indians and Africans and everyone else. Now, if you know sort of South Africa and sort of South African politics, that's quite that's quite a fundamental shift, and it's also playing on sort of this sort of innate inferiority complex of the Afrikaners against the English. They're also trying to become civilized. They're also trying to sort of be recognized as civilized. So I think it is Sastri's work primarily in diplomacy is through sort of the power of articulating a form of language which sort of gives a measure of rights to Indians wherever they are.
I'm glad you flagged Gandhi in your response there, because Sastri and Gandhi had an interesting relationship. Right? It was occasionally combative, acrimonious. They had different ideologies, but they were also empathetic and respectful of each other, where they supported each other at times. Sastri disdained Gandhi's mass politics, his non-cooperation movement, while Gandhi, I think, didn't see much worth in working through colonial institutions and politics to improve India's standing, right? So what was their relationship like?
It's actually, both of them were students of Gokhale. I mean, there's that, as so a lot of people would know that, Gandhi called Gokhale his political guru. And when Gandhi came back to India in 1915, Gokhale asked him to tour the country for a year and not give any political speeches and stuff. And it was while Gandhi was traveling that Gokhale passed away. And when Gokhale passed away, it was assumed that Gokhale wanted Gandhi to sort of take over the servants of Indian society. But the interesting thing is that for about 6 years before that, Sastri had been acting as sort of the second in command of servants of Indian society. So there's this very interesting meeting that happens in late February 1915, where Gandhi comes and there's Sastri and there's everyone of servants of the society, including people like Echin Kunzru. And Gandhi basically lambasts them, arguing that, the idea of service that you have is casteist, is elitist, and Gandhi, in Gandhi's mind, he wanted to create sort of this rural farm kind of thing, like Phoenix and Tolstoy in ashrams in South Africa. And Sastri responds to him at that meeting to say that, this whole idea of sacrifice as a way of serving itself is a very Western idea. The Indian idea is to do everything in moderation. But anyway, so it's sort of a combative meeting, and Gandhi, next day morning, he goes and apologizes to Sastri, as Gandhi did throughout his life. He's very humble and all that, right? But anyway, so the point is that after that, Sastri becomes the leader of servants in this society, and Gandhi sort of charts his own path, and we know what Gandhi did afterwards. But in the 1920s, Gandhi, it's interesting that Sastri takes on sort of the mantle of Gokhale and continues the kind of politics that Gokhale wanted to, whereas Gandhi, in a way, sort of takes on Tilak's mantle. And if you know about Gokhale and Tilak had not just a strained relationship, but kind of a very acrimonious relationship. Tilak was quite mean a lot of times to Gokhale. So the template before of the kind of relationship they could have had was of Gokhale and Tilak. But Sastri and Gandhi, as you said, they were on the opposite side of the spectrum when it came to politics. One was a liberal, Gandhi was sort of a spiritual anarchist or whatever. But in their personal regard for each other, they were not just friends. I mean, Gandhi called him his elder brother. And the letters that they wrote to each other through the 20s and 30s and 40s, they're remarkable, letters in terms of how to communicate. Gandhi often asks for Sastri's, opinions and helps, and of course, almost never agrees with him. But Sastri sort of still continues to sort of, try and advise him. But also Sastri really idolizes Gandhi on the one hand. So towards the end of his life, Sastri delivers these lectures in Ramayana, where his argument basically was that you have to consider Lord Ram as an individual, and his failings are his failings. And it is quite a similar manner he analyzed Gandhi. He argued that Gandhi is the embodiment of Lord Rama, but it doesn't mean he might be trying to live up to his dharma, but it doesn't mean he's always right. Like Lord Ram, he could be wrong a lot of times, and the consequences of his, when he's wrong, are sort of immense, and he can be insufferable at times. But nevertheless, they had a very endearing relationship. Gandhi, in fact, it's not very well known that Sastri actually edited Gandhi's autobiography for for sort of language. So they had quite sort of a relationship which is very different from Gokhale and Tilak, although their political opinions differed quite as much.
Shastri also had a very fraught relationship with the Indian National Congress. And at different points in the book, you do cover how Nehru felt about it, and it was not in very kind terms, right?
Yeah. I think it is, if you look at Indian political history from Indian National Congress point of view, and all of us have been taught to look at Indian national history from that point of view, of course, liberals like Sastri look like advertising agents of the British. But if you look at it from the liberal point of view, it is that, Congress during the 20s and 30s opposed every policy, opposed any kind of political advance, but eventually came around to accepting it. So one take a chance for reforms. First, they accepted it, and then Gandhi went on a non-cooperation movement, and liberals were very critical of the non-cooperation movement precisely for the kind of failures it eventually had. But then, so the Swarajis came back to the assemblies, and Congress by and large agreed with sort of this sort of participating in legislative assemblies. In the late 1920s and early 30s, liberals throughout, from Sapru to Gandhi to Sastri to everyone, were pushing for more and more constitutional reforms, were writing sort of the drafts of probable constitutions, the Nehru report and everything. And Congress sort of, would first agree to something and then sort of, go back to whatever, opposing them, non-cooperation, or I'm forgetting the other big movement. But anyways, and in the roundtable conferences, Congress didn't participate first. Sastri and Nehru had to sort of go to Gandhi and sort of cajole him to participate in the second roundtable conference. Gandhi went to the roundtable conference and basically with the intention of wrecking it, came back, opposed all the political sort of advance sort of reforms. And in 1930, after 1935 Government of India Act, Congress went and formed the ministries. So the liberals, and if you look at it, and even in the early 40s, I mean, Quit India movement and all of that. I mean, liberals were opposed to Quit India movement primarily because they were arguing that Japan is, on our borders. You can't really, not cooperate with the British at this point. And the British had by and large agreed to, or were likely to agree to, principles of dominion status. So from a liberal point of view, if you look at that history, they would argue that most of the advance that happened between 20s and mid 40s and late sort of 40s was primarily by the liberals. Congress just sort of came onto the party late and took credit for everything. And the other thing with liberals was that, one, of course, they were continuously, cooperating in terms of sort of devising constitutional schemes and so on and so forth. But the problem with liberals was that it was a party without followers. Everyone was a leader. Sastri, Sapru, Jaikar, and they were so individualist that they didn't really believe in their party ideas. So Sapru resigns from the Liberal Party in 1930, right? And because they were individualists, they never really built a party. And they were merely interested in sort of creating these schemes. And that meant that Congress really never had any kind of opposition. So when, after the 1935 Government of India Act, when, when sort of political power really turned to mass politics, when, mass elected leaders were to go into positions of power, of course, liberals didn't have any chance. And people like Sastri actually advocated for merging the Liberal Party with the Congress. And of course, the Congress had to agree to some of the conditions, some of the ridiculous conditions, actually. Gandhi's condition of, this sort of Khadi franchise and quite reasonable demands, and his sort of condition on sort of non-cooperation and so on. So what liberals said, as long as if you permanently, not suspend it, but permanently stop all of this and participate in these institutions, liberals should sort of integrate with the Congress. So anyways, the point here is that the way people like Sastri and everyone are remembered today, they're remembered as advertising agents of the British, people who were, I mean, it was just 8th August a few days ago, and everyone who didn't participate in Quit India movement was a villain. But there were very important political differences why people didn't participate in Quit India movement. And a lot of movements that Congress led were, had a whole lot of issues. If you look at it from a liberal point of view, it actually delayed sort of dominion status for India rather than sort of advancing it. So that's the kind of relationship liberals in general and Sastri have with Congress, and that's why they were always angry with Congress, because Congress was like what AAP is today, right? They would sort of not agree to anything and then eventually benefit from the efforts of others.
One thing I kept thinking about as I read the book was the use of the word liberal in different ways, right? Whether it's Shastri's liberal nature and outlook, liberal internationalism, and as you mentioned, the difference and the impact of Indian liberals versus the nationalists. And I get that you tend to use liberal not to describe a particular approach to politics or how things were, but as a way of showing that people like Sastri believed in progress, right, and moving forward, working within certain institutions, even if they were designed to operate against your interests and of your people, right? But there was also very little that was liberal about the internationalism of that era, right? And perhaps even now, even though that kind of framing you use quite liberally to describe the international order. So, I mean, is liberal used in an aspirational manner in the book?
I mean, yes, I'm very liberal with the use of liberal, of course, but it's primarily because the National Liberal Federation, that was the party that they're affiliated with. So in a sense, when I use the word liberal, it's a word that they use for themselves. They used to use the word moderate earlier. So when the first conference happened of the liberals, they called themselves moderates. But in 1919, I think P. Sivaswamy Iyer said, we cannot call ourselves moderates. That gives us sort of, some kind of, as if we are constantly compromising, that kind of approach. We need to sort of define ourselves as liberals. Now, in the Indian context, or in the colonial context, what is meant by liberal is different, of course, from how we know of liberalism. So, of course, a lot of these sort of colonial liberals were inspired by, British liberals, from, J.S. Mills to Herbert Spencer and all that. But they also there's also a conservative bite to them. They're very inspired by Burke, for instance, Edmund Burke. But there's also sort of a sense of understanding of Indian conditions. So, for instance, the father of Indian modern liberalism is sort of, for instance, M.S. Ranade. And Ranade is, while he is liberal in terms, his argument was that you could not be liberal in halves. So you have to be political liberal as well as a social liberal. Whereas in case of India, you find people who may be politically liberal, but not socially liberal. They're social conservatives. But the way Ranade defined it, that's what a liberal ought to be. You have to be politically liberal, which meant that you cannot really be a revolutionary. You need to sort of think about political advance within the British system, but also you have to be socially progressive, and the social battle and the political battle happen sort of hand in hand. They go together. You cannot appeal for political liberty first and then assume social democracy will come later. As Ambedkar said later, there is no social democracy. There is no sort of political democracy without any social democracy, because rights are ensured not by law but by social conscience. You can have the greatest of rights enshrined in the constitution, but if your social conscience is, and part of it is what we are witnessing in India today. But nevertheless, so that's the stream of liberalism that people like Sastri is drawing from, and Gokhale, when he creates servitude in the society, tries to bring those two streams together, of political liberal as well as social liberal. But then, like you said, I use the term liberally in the sense that liberal internationalism, and as I say in the book, it's basically a broad tent. It could be anything. But there's a particular way in which liberal internationalism is argued about that people like, Eikenberry and others who see it in very sort of benign terms. Somebody like Sastri would, I think, call himself a liberal international, because they did believe in certain ideas of international progress and peace and so on and so forth. But they found it hypocritical because of the racial discrimination that was quite inherent with it. So in a way, then Sastri's problem is not with liberal internationalism, but with the hypocrisies. And his solution, or the way he deals with it, of course, is by giving voice to those hypocrisies, by sort of exposing those hypocrisies and say you can't be saying this and doing this. So therefore, if you have to be liberal, you have to be liberal in full, not in liberal in half. So that's why there's a lot of sort of, I agree with you that, it's the term liberal is used liberally, and it could mean different things at different places. But there is also a certain consistency, like you said, from his personal behavior, which is also very liberal, of never really not engaging in conversation, of always trying to find a reasoned way out of an issue. And that goes from his personal life to the international life that he had.
I mean, the other thing, the other kind of aspect of that, the argument around liberalism, especially liberal internationalism, right, was that the world and the times that he lived in, especially the 1919 to 1929, I mean, those times were enormously hierarchical and dominated by power, right, and not necessarily, I mean, relative to norms and ideas related to equality, which was his kind kind of major focus and objective, right? I think that period was a heyday of power politics in Europe. Right? I mean, the interregnum between two wars where things were always on a powder keg, right? Did his liberal disposition blind him from the fraught nature of international politics as well?
I mean, yes and no in a way, because while it is like you correctly say, I mean, Europe is always on a sort of, the rivalries are developing there. But at the same time, and that was whole, E.H. Carr's critique, that a whole lot of people are unwilling to see it because they're trying to invest a lot in norms. So this period is also a period where you see a lot of normative arrangements being thought about, right? One, of course, is the whole idea of self-determination, ideas of Commonwealth, World Federation, empires are crumbling into nation states. So there's also a lot of space for sort of normative sort of reimagination, the Caleb Bryan Pact, where war is outlawed. So there's a lot of promise also in that period, in the 20s. But I think it's in the late 20s and early 30s, with the great sort of crash and then the rise of Hitler, that really, and the party comes to an end, where, power politics or real politique in a way sort of manifests itself. 20s, I sort of do like to think it's still very much open for normative articulations and normatively sort of reconstructing the world. And there are a whole lot of initiatives, League Nations, which is quite different from, which is partly seen as sort of a lesson from the war, a lesson from the World War One, where World War One is assumed to be a result of sort of this naked form of power politics. And there is an effort to sort of move out of it. Whether they were successfully able to do that or not, that's of course a different sort of question. But there is a lot of investment in sort of normative ideas, and that's where I think people like Sastri see this sort of find their sort of space of maneuver, even within sort of the British Commonwealth, for instance. Initially Sastri is pushing for the ideas of this imperial citizenship, that we are all equal subjects of the empire. But in the mid-1920s, when basically Britain withdraws its hand and Britain says, oh, we can't really push these dominions to do anything. But what we'll do is we'll allow India to sort of engage with them bilaterally. Now, that is a power politics move from Britain, because it cannot sort of enforce its norms. But in a way, it also proves advantageous for India, because now India can bilaterally negotiate with these countries, and that's where the Cape Town Agreement of 1927 happened. So there are opportunities, even when this power politics is sort of becoming more and more manifest, and I think Sastri sort of tries to move there. There is a lot of space for sort of normative engagement, but I think it ends by the 1920s and early 30s, and that's where I think the real power politics sort of takes over.
So Sastri was a Tamil Brahmin.
Yeah.
And so how did his caste as a Tamil Brahmin influence his work and his diplomacy and what he accomplished in his life?
I mean, first, of course, because he's a Brahmin, he gains access to a lot of places where if he wouldn't. So, for instance, when he goes to the Dominions, Canada in particular, there are these whole debates about, Sastri is a Brahmin. He's quite unlike all the Indians we have, the coolies, which are sort of 90% of them are lower caste and so on and so forth. So therefore, he ought to be engaged in a different way. He ought to be treated well. And he speaks English very well and all of that, right? So there's a certain sort of investment in his sort of, or sort of benefit of what he is as an upper class Brahmin. And I think I start the book with this sort of small vignette when he goes to Canada, where a Canadian newspaper starts with this whole thing that this guy is here, he's a Brahmin, who are sort of the pristine caste of India, the intellectuals, and therefore we ought to treat them well. So there is that aspect of his caste giving him access, but he's also quite aware of this. It also sort of works against him in many ways, because the argument in the Dominions then is that Sastri is an exception to the Indians that usually come to these places. So you might allow Sastri sort of an equal place, or the Prime Minister may sort of throw a dinner party for him, but that reinforces the argument why we should not do it for the rest of the Indians, because they are not really of the same sort of makeup. In a way subverts his idea that there is racial discrimination, because they would say to him, well, we are allowing you sort of an equal seat at the table, so it can't really be racial discrimination, right? We are sort of, it's maybe class-based, but it's not race. So in a way subverts in many ways his diplomacy. But he plays the role of, in the book I call him sort of the petite civilizer. When he goes to South Africa, for instance, there's a lot of focus on uplift of the Indian community, and at times, and he, in fact, he lectures Indian community on, hygiene, on what they need to do to uplift, on education. There's a lot of focus where he acts as the civilizer for Indians. There's also the aspect where, and it's the difference where, for instance, when he goes to Kenya and when he goes to South Africa, so he comes to Kenya after a very successful stint in South Africa, and the Kenyans refuse to engage with him because the Kenyan Indians argue that Sastri, representing South African Indians, is, he's representing those coolies. It's fine, but we are not really coolies. We are, the effort was to turn Kenya into America of the Hindu, right? So we are these upper caste Indians, and therefore we don't need to be represented by Sastri. And finally, in his own diplomacy, personally, because he's, or at least his performance, he is anti-caste. So he gives several speeches in South Africa where he says to South African whites that I understand why you want to be sort of segregated, why you want to remain separate. I'm a Tamil Brahmin. But remember, casteism is responsible for India's colonization. Casteism is what has kept India, in a wretched state for the past, so many hundreds of years. And it's only when we're trying to come out of this casteism that we can think of progressing. And therefore, he would argue that race would do something similar to South Africa. So he builds sort of this affinity where he's trying to tell South African whites that I understand why you're trying to do it, but the end result isn't going to be great. So the caste is always present, I think, in his personal conduct, as well as in the politics that he articulates. Unfortunately, caste is not really seen as an important ingredient, sort of, when we think about international relations. But in case of India, I do think, in fact, one of the arguments, I don't make it as specifically in the book, but I think I'm trying to develop it. There's that Indian foreign policy actually emerges out of a certain understanding of caste, where where it coincides with the end of indenture, and in the 1920s, when people like Sastri are articulating for the rights of Indians, what they're saying is, we understand you wanted to keep these coolies out, but the new Indian that is coming to the colonies in the 1920s is not the coolie. They are like the Kenyans, Indians. So therefore, the right. The battle for rights for Indians is the battle for rights for this new immigrant, and not the previous one, the coolie, because that's been stopped in 1980. So there is, I think, it's not a coincidence that the end of indenture in South Indian foreign policy or Indian diplomacy. I think there's a story to tell there as
well. In terms of sources, you're a historian. You use Shastri's papers to write the book. What was that like, and what more can be gleaned from there?
Actually, I'm not really a historian. I'm an international relations scholar who's desperately trying hard to be a historian. But of course, there are Sastri's papers, the papers of his secretary Kuranda Rao, and Servant Civil Society papers. the Gargill Library in Pune has most of Servants of India's sort of a society newsletters and everything, and it's a great resource. Newspapers sort of around the world sort of followed them. So in terms of sort of, and of course, British Library and some papers in Cambridge and in South Africa and other places. In terms of, I think, what more can be sort of gleaned from them, I think there's a lot that could be written on liberalism in India, and I think that's what I'm also trying to do now, because the liberal story is never really told. I mean, whether they're villains or heroes, that's sort of a debate for later. But I think it's important to tell their story. What were they trying to do? And we don't know enough about them. But there is sort of a vibrant debate happening even among liberals about forms of politics and what is politics, and what is possible and what is achievable, and critiques of for instance Gandhi's movements, and they're not sort of criticisms of sort of parochial nature. They are serious criticisms and genuine criticisms. So there's a lot, I think, that could be done, because that kind of tradition we've forgotten. And in case of Sastri, I argue, for instance, it's quite ironical that most of India's diplomacy initially was about sort of trying to sort of give more rights to Indians overseas. Now we're busy trying to taking away rights from Indians within India. So it's quite telling, right? And therefore, I think there is that part of history that needs to be told more for our own understandings of what Indian liberalism is and is supposed to be.
And finally, how would Sastri regard Indian foreign policy today?
Well, actually, I had, I've been in contact with Sastri's family, his great-granddaughter. His granddaughter is actually, two of his granddaughters are alive. So I sent my book to them, his great-granddaughter, and she wrote to me saying that, they liked the book and everything. And then they said, but there's one paragraph that we don't agree with, which is the one you wrote about Modi. The one where you say that, the statement I just made. And they kind of believe that Sastri would agree with the current government and and all of that and what they're doing. I disagree. I do think that people like Sastri and others were, as students of Gokhale, they were quite secular in the external politics. I mean, this is not to say that they were, they are sort of great scholars of Hinduism. Sastri wrote a whole book on Ramayana, a book of lectures on Ramayana. But when he did that, it raised major controversy because his primary argument was that Lord Rama has to be seen as an individual and not God. So there is a lot that they draw from Indian scriptures and Hindu philosophy, but they're also fundamentally secular. And their vision of India is of a secular, modern, very sort of British way, India. So this is not something, so I kind of believe that, they won't like the India of today. But in terms of Indian foreign policy, I think there is a lot of focus, even in Sastri's diplomacy, on the emphasis of the individual. And that is partly because India did not have any structural power, like you're saying. So a lot of India's diplomacy was personalized. In South Africa, for instance, when Sastri was first sent as agent, there was a whole debate about, so what kind of position is this? Is this an ambassadorial position? Is it a diplomatic position, or sort of a normal agent? And because he was a privy councillor, it was agreed that he had to be given the status of a minister of South African government, which meant that everyone who followed after him had to be given the same status, and therefore it became an ambassadorial position. So the point being that it was very much personality driven. So the context in a way is very different from Indian foreign policy today. So I may not be able to say much about what he would think about foreign policy. But in terms of what India is today, I'm quite sure he wouldn't be happy.
Vineet, that was great. Thank you so much for joining us, and congratulations on the book.
Thanks so much again, Karthik. It was wonderful chatting.